There's a quiet crisis spreading through men today, and it has nothing to do with muscles, money, or motivation. It's identity. The one thing modern life told them they didn't need. For centuries, men knew their role. They built, protected, provided, and, for better or worse, that gave them purpose. But in the span of a few generations, that map was burned. Now, men are told they're both the problem and the solution, expected to lead without leading, to feel without faltering, to succeed without pride, and to apologize for existing in systems they didn't design. It's no wonder so many are lost. The modern man wakes up every day walking a psychological tightrope between relevance and redundancy. He's told to be sensitive, but not soft, confident, but not arrogant, successful, but never too loud about it. Every instinct is questioned, every trait second-guessed. The result isn't evolution, it's paralysis. So he retreats into silence, work, or distraction, numbing the noise with whatever makes him feel useful again. But the irony is brutal. The world still expects him to perform like the old archetype while shaming him for it at the same time. He's both obsolete and obligated, a ghost trying to live up to expectations that contradict each other. The truth is, men aren't broken. They're confused by a culture that dismantled their structure without replacing it with anything meaningful. This isn't a war on masculinity, it's a famine of purpose. And the men you see withdrawing, joking, or zoning out aren't apathetic. They're starving for identity in a world that told them identity was offensive. The mechanism behind the modern male identity crisis is what psychologists call role collapse, when the social scripts that once defined meaning disintegrate faster than new ones can form. For centuries, manhood was transactional. Work hard, provide, protect, repeat. The rules were clear, even if they were flawed. But now, every rulebook has been shredded, and what replaced it is ambiguity. Men are told to evolve emotionally, but given no model of what that looks like. They're urged to reject toxic masculinity, but rarely shown what healthy masculinity actually is. The result is internal chaos, a psychological void where definition used to live. Without an identity tethered to contribution, the male psyche drifts toward numbness. That's not weakness, it's wiring. The male brain finds worth in output. When the outputs lose value, so does the self. Add to that a culture that measures men by optics instead of essence, and effort becomes theater. He no longer asks, "Who am I?" but "What am I allowed to be?" It's a question no one can answer because the parameters keep changing. This is why so many men are anxious but can't explain why. It's not failure anxiety, it's identity anxiety, a sense that the ground beneath them is moving while they're expected to stand still. The irony is that the destruction of rigid gender roles was supposed to free everyone, but freedom without direction is disorientation. You can't just tell men to be better without telling them how. Role collapse doesn't just erase pressure, it erases purpose. And when purpose disappears, men don't erupt, they erode. The confusion doesn't always look dramatic. It looks like detachment, distraction, and quiet despair masked as calm. He's the guy in his 30s who did everything right. College, career, decent apartment, reliable car, and yet every morning he stares at the ceiling, feeling like he's missing an invisible exam everyone else seems to be passing. His life is stable but hollow, achievement without identity. He scrolls through motivational clips and podcasts about purpose, but they all sound like noise now. His father told him to be strong. His boss tells him to be flexible. Social media tells him to be interesting. None of it feels like him. Another man hides his confusion behind competence. He's married, kind, dependable, but his wife says he's emotionally unavailable. He doesn't understand what she means. He listens, nods, apologizes, but deep down he feels punished for being consistent. The world applauds him for showing up, then criticizes him for not showing enough. So he shuts down. At work, he's praised for productivity and punished for presence, told to innovate but not offend, to lead but not dominate. Every version of masculinity feels like the wrong one. Then there's the young man who has stopped trying altogether. He sees the world as a rigged game, every path lined with risk and ridicule. He withdraws into gaming, substances, or isolation because digital worlds still reward effort, even if real ones don't. They're not broken. They're disoriented. These aren't men rejecting responsibility. They're men searching for relevance. When no one tells you what you're good for anymore, you stop knowing who you are. And when a generation of men feels that collectively, it doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like apathy. The quiet epidemic isn't rage, it's resignation. Not because men don't care, but because caring feels obsolete in a world that doesn't seem to need them anymore. Biologically, men were built for direction. The male brain evolved to specialize in linear thinking, problem-solving, and goal orientation, traits that once made survival possible. But the modern environment has shifted faster than biology could adapt. Today, survival isn't about protection or provision. It's about relevance. The same instincts that once drove purpose now backfire in a culture where there's nothing tangible to protect and no one clear to provide for. Psychologically, this creates what researchers call existential displacement, a chronic sense of restlessness caused by misfired wiring. The drive to contribute hasn't disappeared, it's just starved of feedback. Men are still hunting, just now for meaning instead of food. Without a visible target, that drive turns inward and becomes anxiety, depression, or escapism. And because men are taught to equate emotion with weakness, they rarely talk about it. The nervous system responds by shutting down stimulation. Dopamine drops, motivation evaporates, and the body slips into what's known as adaptive disengagement. He feels nothing, not because he's broken, but because his system is conserving energy for a fight that no longer exists. Add to that the social message that masculinity is a liability, and you get millions of men unconsciously suppressing the very traits that once kept them alive. The biological instinct to matter collides with the psychological reality of invisibility, and the result is numbness disguised as stoicism. The tragedy is that these same instincts, focus, discipline, endurance, are not outdated. They're misdirected. When men are given goals that align with values instead of vanity, the chemistry reignites. Purpose reactivates dopamine. Contribution revives confidence. The biology never stopped working. It's just waiting for a mission worthy of turning itself back on. The signs of the modern male identity crisis are everywhere, hiding in plain sight under the label of normal. The first sign is emotional muting. He's not heartless. He's just learned that expression gets him punished more often than praised. The second is displaced drive. He pours intensity into work, fitness, or gaming because those arenas still offer rules and measurable results. The third is narrative fatigue. He's tired of being told what kind of man he should be, so he stops listening altogether. The fourth is relationship withdrawal. He still loves deeply, but shows it passively, afraid that action will be misinterpreted as control. The fifth is quiet comparison. He measures his worth against an endless feed of louder, richer, happier men, until every small win feels meaningless. The sixth is hyper-independence. He stops asking for help, convinced that needing others will only confirm the stereotype that he's fragile. The seventh is moral confusion. He wants to lead but doesn't know what leadership even means anymore, so he stays silent to avoid being wrong. The eighth is performative confidence. He looks composed, but inside he's improvising, terrified that someone will notice he has no real map. And the final sign is existential drift. The sense that life keeps moving but he's somehow stationary, watching it through glass. These men don't announce their confusion, they manage it. They smile, provide, perform, and joke, all while quietly disassociating from a self that no longer feels like theirs. The tragedy is that the symptoms of being lost look too much like functioning. But underneath the routine, the collapse is happening in slow motion. A man doesn't fall apart when he breaks down. He falls apart when he stops knowing what he's for. The men who find their way back don't rebuild by reinventing masculinity. They rebuild by re-owning it. The first countersignal is reconnection. He stops waiting for permission to be himself and starts defining what being a man means on his own terms. It's not rebellion, it's reclamation. The second is authentic vulnerability, not the kind that trends on podcasts, but the kind that sounds like, "I'm scared I'm wasting my life," said without flinching. The third is purpose reorientation. He stops chasing validation and starts pursuing meaning. He trades status for structure, noise for focus, applause for fulfillment. The fourth is community repair. He reconnects with other men not through competition, but collaboration. Brotherhood replaces bravado. The fifth is micro-honesty, small daily truths that keep him from drifting into numbness. I'm tired. I'm lonely. I don't know. Each admission rewires his brain away from suppression toward self-trust. The sixth is embodiment. He starts using his body again, not to perform, but to feel. Sweat becomes therapy. Movement becomes meditation. The seventh is narrative agency. He stops letting culture define him and starts narrating his own story, flaws and all. The eighth is creative contribution. He builds something again, not for likes, but for legacy. Men heal through doing. The ninth is acceptance of paradox. He learns he can be strong and soft, protective and peaceful, confident and uncertain, all at once. Resilience isn't about going back to the old ways. It's about integrating what was lost with what was learned. A man reclaims himself not by fighting the new world, but by showing up in it as something it didn't expect, anchored, awake, and unapologetically real. The modern male identity crisis doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's amplified by the noise of a culture built to confuse him. The first antagonist is algorithmic masculinity. Social media feeds him caricatures of what a real man should be. Hyper-alpha podcasters, shirtless motivation, and quick fixes for existential pain. Each scroll deepens his disorientation, telling him to dominate, detach, or disappear. The second is feminized validation, a world where men increasingly seek approval from systems that weren't designed to reflect them. Schools reward compliance, workplaces prize diplomacy, and dating apps reward curation over authenticity. He learns to contort himself into what sells instead of who he is. The third is emotional isolation. The average man today has fewer close friends than any generation before him, and it's killing his ability to process meaning. Loneliness rewires the brain to interpret every challenge as threat. The fourth is commercial identity, a system that replaces belonging with branding. Instead of brotherhood, he gets merch. Instead of mentorship, he gets content. The fifth is gender politics fatigue. He's tired of being told what men used to be, what they shouldn't be, and what they must now become. He's not angry at change. He's exhausted by contradiction. The sixth is silent competition. Every other man becomes a benchmark, not a brother. Even success feels hollow when it exists only to prove something. And the final amplifier is emotional illiteracy. Decades of man-up culture left men fluent in strategy but illiterate in self. They can fix systems, but not themselves. These antagonists thrive because confusion sells, and stillness doesn't. But awareness dulls their power. The man who disconnects from comparison starts hearing his own frequency again. When he stops performing for the algorithm and starts living for alignment, the static quiets and the signal returns. When men lose their sense of identity, the fallout doesn't make headlines. It makes emptiness. The first consequence is emotional invisibility. Without a stable sense of self, men stop broadcasting feeling, so the world assumes they're fine. Inside, they're drowning quietly. The second is relationship erosion. Partners interpret his withdrawal as disinterest, not realizing it's confusion. He doesn't know what version of himself to bring, so he brings none. Conversations become logistics, intimacy becomes performance, and connection fades under the weight of pretense. The third is cultural disengagement. A generation of men stops contributing meaningfully because it no longer knows how to. Art, politics, innovation, all suffer when the instinct to build loses direction. The fourth is ideological extremism. Some men, desperate for clarity, find it in tribalism. Radical movements give them what modern life won't: identity with edges. It's not hate they're drawn to, it's structure. The fifth is mental collapse. Anxiety and depression become default states masked by sarcasm and self-deprecation. He'll joke about being dead inside, but it's not humor. It's a confession. The sixth is sexual disconnection. Desire fades when meaning does. Porn becomes easier than vulnerability, and intimacy turns mechanical. The seventh is existential drift. He's alive but not awake, successful but unfulfilled, surrounded but alone. The most tragic consequence, though, is generational mimicry. Lost fathers raise sons who inherit their confusion, and daughters who inherit their disappointment. When men stop defining themselves, everyone else defines them by default. The world doesn't crumble when men lose identity. It calcifies. It becomes efficient but empty, functional but soulless. Because when half the population forgets who they are, the other half loses balance too. A civilization can survive war and famine, but not apathy. And that's the quiet apocalypse no one is watching happen. Reclaiming identity doesn't start with slogans or movements. It starts with ownership. The men who find themselves again don't wait for society to redefine masculinity for them. They build it from the inside out. Agency begins with responsibility, not guilt. He stops apologizing for existing and starts asking, "What do I stand for?" The second step is integration. He gathers the fragments, strength, empathy, logic, emotion, and fuses them instead of choosing sides. Modern masculinity isn't about picking a polarity, it's about mastering both. The third is presence. He starts showing up not as what he thinks he should be, but as who he actually is. No armor, no audition. When he speaks, it's from alignment, not anxiety. The fourth is discipline of depth. Instead of chasing surface-level validation, he invests in things that last. Craft, character, consistency. He learns that self-worth isn't built in achievements but maintained through integrity. The fifth is connection through purpose. Men heal in motion. He finds other men not to compete with, but to build with. Brotherhood returns when competition evolves into collaboration. The sixth is emotional fluency. He doesn't need to cry on cue or write poetry to be in touch with himself. He just learns to name what he feels without shame. The seventh is direction. He stops reacting to the culture and starts creating within it. When he finds a mission, he stops needing permission. And the eighth is impact. He contributes again, not to be praised, but to be useful, because usefulness is what reconnects men to meaning. Agency isn't about going backward. It's about returning to balance. A man with purpose is not dangerous. He's dependable. The goal isn't to make men louder. It's to make them real. In the end, the modern male identity crisis isn't a tragedy. It's a transition. Men aren't disappearing. They're molting. The old armor no longer fits, but the new skin still feels raw. This in-between, the awkward, uncertain middle, isn't weakness. It's evolution in real time. The men who survive it aren't the loudest or the angriest. They're the ones willing to rebuild meaning from scratch. They're learning that masculinity isn't performance. It's posture. It's not domination, but direction. Not control, but consciousness. The world doesn't need the old archetype of unfeeling providers or the new caricature of performative sensitivity. It needs something braver. Balanced men who can protect without pride, nurture without shame, and stand still without losing themselves. That's the new frontier of masculinity. Not power over others, but power over one's own chaos. When a man finds that center, he becomes unstoppable. Not because he's immune to failure, but because failure no longer defines him. And when enough men make that shift, from confusion to clarity, from numbness to nuance, the ripple effect changes everything. Society stabilizes, families heal, women breathe easier, the world becomes grounded again. Because when men remember who they are, everything around them starts to remember too. This isn't a crisis to survive, it's a calling to evolve. The only question left is, will men answer it, or stay silent while the world writes their story for them? This isn't the end of masculinity, it's the moment it finally wakes up.